The diner glowed warm against the chilly November night, its neon sign flickering "Rusty's Rest" over a sleepy stretch of highway. Inside, the air buzzed with the low hum of conversation, the clatter of plates, and the occasional burst of laughter from a booth in the back. Henry Dawson, the counterman, presided over the scene with a practiced ease. At 58, he was a wiry figure with a shock of gray hair and a grin that could charm or cut depending on his mood. Tonight, he leaned against the counter, wiping down a spotless surface, swapping stories with a couple of truckers who'd been stopping by for decades. Henry prided himself on reading people, knowing who belonged, who didn't, and how to handle both. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. Then the door chimed and a stranger stepped in, a man whose quiet entrance promised a story Henry couldn't yet guess, one that would unravel everything he assumed about his little kingdom. The newcomer was a black man in his early 60s, dressed in a simple overcoat and a flat cap pulled low. His face carried the lines of a life well lived, and he moved with a slow, deliberate gait, leaning lightly on a cane. The diner's chatter dipped for a split second as eyes flicked toward him, then away. He eased onto a stool at the far end of the counter, setting his cane against the edge with a soft clack. Henry sauntered over, his towel slung over his shoulder, his voice carrying that casual edge he used to test newcomers. "What'll it be, friend?" he asked, eyeing the man up and down. "Coffee, black," the man replied, his tone steady and polite but firm enough to signal he wasn't here for small talk. Henry raised an eyebrow, pouring the coffee with a flourish. "Just coffee? In a place like this? We've got pie, burgers, real food, you know." He slid the mug across the counter, letting a chuckle slip out, loud enough to catch a smirk from a regular 2 stools down. The man nodded, unfazed. "Coffee's fine, thanks." He took a sip, his eyes drifting over the diner, past the cracked vinyl booths, the faded photos on the walls, the cluster of locals nursing beers. Henry leaned in, resting an elbow on the counter. "Not from around here, are you? You've got that look, like you're sizing us up." The man's gaze met Henry's, calm and unyielding. "Just passing through," he said, taking it all in. Henry laughed, a sharp bark that turned a few heads. "Taking it in? This ain't a museum, pal. It's a diner. People eat, they drink, they move on. Simple as that." The trucker nearby snickered, egging Henry on. But the man didn't flinch. He sipped his coffee again, his silence a wall Henry couldn't crack. Minutes ticked by, and Henry's curiosity twisted into something sharper. He straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. "You know, most folks who stop here have a story. You don't look like you're sharing yours." "Don't need to," the man said, setting his mug down. "I'm just here to watch." "Watch?" Henry's grin faltered, replaced by a frown. "Watch what? The coffee cool? Weird one, huh?" He muttered the last part under his breath, just loud enough for the trucker to chuckle again. The man slid a $10 bill across the counter. "Keep it," he said, standing with deliberate care, gripping his cane. Henry's eyes narrowed. "Coffee's $2, mister. What's this, a bribe?" "Call it a tip," the man replied, turning toward a door marked "Staff Only" at the back. Henry's patience snapped. "Hey, hold up, you can't go in there," he called, rounding the counter. The man kept walking, unbothered, and pushed the door open, stepping inside. Henry turned to the trucker, baffled. "You see that? Who does this guy think he is?" The trucker shrugged, sipping his beer. "Beats me, Henry. Maybe you ought to find out." Grumbling, Henry stormed after him, his boots thumping against the linoleum. He didn't know it yet, but the night was about to flip upside down, and the lesson waiting behind that door would stay with him long after the last patron left. Henry shoved the door open, ready to lay into the stranger, but the sight stopped him cold. The man sat behind a cluttered desk in the cramped office, a ledger open in front of him, his cane propped against the wall. He didn't look up, just kept flipping pages, his fingers tracing lines of numbers. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Henry demanded, his voice booming in the small space. The man finally met his eyes, his expression cool as steel. "I could ask you the same, Henry." The use of his name jolted Henry back a step. "How do you know me? And who are you to barge in here like you own the place?" The man leaned back, folding his hands. "Because I do. Name's Walter Brooks. I'm the owner of Rusty's Rest." Henry blinked, his brain scrambling to catch up. "Owner? You're full of it. Rusty's belongs to old man Caldwell. Been that way forever." Walter shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Caldwell was my cousin. He passed last year, left this place to me. I've been keeping tabs on it from afar, checking in, listening. Tonight, I came to see it for myself." Henry's mouth opened, then shut. Caldwell, gruff, generous Caldwell, had been a fixture here for 40 years, pouring beers and flipping burgers until his heart gave out. Word was the diner had gone to some distant relative, but Henry never pictured this. "You're lying," he said, though his voice wavered. "Prove it." Walter reached into his coat, pulling out a worn key ring, keys Henry recognized as the spares Caldwell once kept. "These say otherwise," Walter said, dangling them briefly before setting them on the desk. Henry stared, the truth sinking in like a stone. Walter continued, his voice measured but firm. "I've been watching you, Henry. For weeks. Heard how you talk to folks, how you size them up, decide who fits your little world. Tonight was the last straw." Henry's face flushed, a mix of anger and shame boiling up. "What's that supposed to mean? I run this counter fine. Keep the place humming. You can't just—" "I can," Walter cut in, standing now, his cane back in hand. "You've got a habit of judging people before they open their mouths. That stops now." He stepped past Henry, heading back to the diner floor. Henry trailed him, his confidence unraveling with every step. The room hushed as Walter emerged, Henry a shadow behind him. Regulars paused mid-bite, sensing the shift. Walter raised his voice, clear and steady. "Evening, everyone. I'm Walter Brooks, the new owner of Rusty's Rest. Took over from my cousin Caldwell a while back." A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. Whispers, wide eyes, forks clinking against plates. Walter turned to Henry, his gesture sharp. "And this man's done his last shift here." Henry's knees buckled slightly. "You're firing me? For what? A couple of smart remarks?" Walter's gaze didn't waver. "For disrespecting people who walk through that door. For acting like this place is yours to gatekeep. Everyone deserves a seat here. Truckers, strangers, me. You forgot that." The diner erupted into murmurs. A gray-haired woman in a corner booth nodded slowly. A burly man at the counter grunted in agreement. Henry sputtered, "I was just joking around. It's how I keep things light." "Jokes don't belittle people," Walter said, his tone final. "Pack your things, Henry. You're out." The words landed like a gavel. Henry stood frozen, the weight of his own arrogance crashing down. Slowly, he shuffled to the back, grabbing his jacket and a handful of personal odds and ends. A mug, a faded photo of him and Caldwell from years back. The diner watched in silence, a mix of shock and understanding settling over them. Walter faced the crowd again, his demeanor softening. "This place has been a haven for a long time. My cousin made it that way. I'm here to keep it alive, make it better. No one gets turned away, no one gets judged. That's my promise." The room broke into applause. Not wild, but warm, the kind that comes from folks who've seen enough to know what matters. Walter nodded, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. Henry slipped out the back door, his head low, the cold biting at his face. He'd spent years behind that counter thinking he held the reins. Now he saw the truth. He'd misread the room, misread people, and paid the price. The lesson burned, a reminder that respect isn't optional, no matter how long you've stood your ground. Days turned to weeks, and Rusty's Rest found a new rhythm under Walter's watch. He didn't hover, didn't preach, just worked the place with a steady hand. He hired a new counterman, a cheerful widower named Ed who greeted everyone like family. The regulars adjusted, some grumbling at first about Henry's exit, but most came around. The diner felt lighter, warmer, a spot where stories flowed freely and no one felt out of place. Walter kept his cane by the register, a quiet presence as he poured coffee or flipped through the ledger. Customers started asking about him, his life, his plans, and he'd share just enough. A career in logistics, a retirement cut short by Caldwell's passing, a promise to keep the old man's dream alive. He listened more than he talked, his eyes catching details Henry had missed, tired truckers needing an extra smile, locals nursing unspoken woes. One night, a month in, the gray-haired woman from the corner booth lingered after her meal. She approached Walter, her voice soft but firm. "You did right by this place," she said. "Henry was a good laugh, but he didn't see people. Not really. You do." Walter tipped his cap slightly. "Takes a lifetime to learn that, ma'am. I'm still working on it." She smiled, leaving a generous tip before heading into the night. Walter watched her go, then turned back to the counter, the diner humming around him. It wasn't just a business, it was a trust, handed down from Caldwell, now his to carry. He'd face down Henry's bluster not for spite, but for principle, and the reward was this: a room full of faces, each one welcome. Henry, meanwhile, didn't vanish entirely. Word spread he'd taken a job at a gas station down the road. Quieter now, less brash. Some said he'd learned his lesson, others weren't sure. But at Rusty's, his absence left space for something better, a reminder etched into the wood and neon that respect builds more than arrogance ever could. For Walter, it was enough. He'd come as a stranger, judged and dismissed, only to claim what was his and set things right. The diner stood as proof. Sometimes the quiet ones hold the keys, and the loudest voices fade when the truth walks in. One stranger redefined a diner's soul. This tale reminds us that respect outweighs arrogance every time. If Walter's stand resonated with you, give this video a like to show it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more stories that hit home. What lesson would you carry from Henry's fall? Share your wisdom in the comments below. We're all ears. Until next time, keep this close. True strength whispers, never shouts.